Welcome, everyone. I'm Stefan Verhulst. I'm the co-founder of GovLab, and also on the faculty of the Center for Urban Science and Progress. And delighted that you all made it here through our wonderful snow day, the only snow day, I guess, that we're going to have in New York City. But before we start, let me ask Zach to open us up and explain more about Open Data Week, which, of course, all of you are excited about. And that's probably the reason why you're here. Over to you.
I'm going to try to get into the Zoom shot. Sorry to just loom in front of everyone for a minute. But hi, everyone. My name is Zachary Fader. I am with the city's open data team at the Office of Technology and Innovation. Welcome to New York City's Open Data Week. This is the 7th year we have had Open Data Week. And so happy to have you and to have GovLab join us, whether you're here virtually or in person. And our office, the Office of Technology and Innovation, we work to make New York City's open data both available to New Yorkers by putting it on the Open Data website. If you've not been, there is data on pretty much every facet of city life. It is nyc.gov/open-data. We also work to make open data accessible to New Yorkers. And one of the ways that we do that is by co-organizing the Open Data Week Festival. And we do that in partnership with the civic tech organization Beta NYC, who is having their School of Data conference on Saturday to close out New York City Open Data Week. Tickets are still available if you're interested in going. And also in partnership with the Art Collective Data Through Design. If you've ever wondered what these data sets look like as a piece of artwork or a musical composition, or some other thing that's a bit more tangible than a lot of rows of a spreadsheet, you can go check out the Data Through Design exhibition. It is at a gallery in Hell's Kitchen called Prime Produce, and it's open 12 to 7 through this Sunday. I have not been yet this year, but really inventive, getting a thumbs up, inventive, wonderful ways of taking this open data and making it more visible. And really, again, if you're new to open data, if you're an open data veteran, there are sessions throughout the entire week. So this is one of the sessions that we're thrilled to be able to present. But we have sessions for complete beginners. If you want to get a sense of what open data is, just the basics. We have discovering open data classes every single day of the week. So through this Friday, the week proper, taught by volunteer open data ambassadors. And you can see those, and every other event, you could learn how to use Python to access open data. You can learn about open data visualization. You can talk to some of the many city agencies that make open data available. All of that schedule is available at open-data.nyc. We're also going to be posting recordings of events at that same website, hopefully a few weeks after Open Data Week is over, including ideally this event as well. So in case you miss anything, you'll be able to rewatch it then. But thank you again so much to all of the organizers at GovLab for today's event and the panelists. Also, thank you to the city's Chief Analytics Officer, Martha Norick, who's in the audience today. And one of the people who helps to make open data and Open Data Week possible. And with that, I will turn it over to Stefan to kick off the session. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for these opening words. And thanks also for the ongoing commitment around open data. I mean, I think New York City has been a leader on open data, and the Open Data Week has been part of that leadership, which we've been delighted to be part of. And in fact, as I was mentioning, our last public event that GovLab held was about 3 years ago, which was just before the pandemic, which, as you might know, was exactly 3 years ago. And so the last event was indeed around open data. And at that time, we were focusing on how would you identify and source 100 questions for which we need open data. And I think that might be something that we will call or touch upon again through this panel as well. Again, thanks for being here. And so, as already mentioned, I'm the co-founder of GovLab. And so for those who don't know GovLab, we are an action research center. We are based here at CUSP and at the Tandon School for Engineering. And our focus is on how do we transform the way we make decisions in society? How do we make them more legitimate? How do we make them more effective at the same time? And what we are focusing on is what we call new assets that technology and tools have provided us in order to change the way we go about making decisions, the way we go about solving public problems, the way we go about designing public services, for instance, as well. And those two assets that we are focusing on are, on the one hand, people. So we do a lot of work around how do we engage with people in new ways? How do we tap into the collective intelligence that resides within cities and elsewhere? And how do we transform the way we indeed learn from citizens and actually co-design solutions as well? So that's one area. And then the other area is, surprise, surprise, data, where we focus on how can you leverage data in new ways to solve public problems, to address some of the challenges that we have. And by doing that, what we came to the realization is that quite often people that work on one side of the asset, the citizen engagement part, and those that seek on how do we change the way we engage with citizens, quite often never talk with the other side, i.e. the ones that are working on data and how to make data open. And so what we hope to do today is actually cross those two communities and really try to look into how do we actually use open data to, on the one hand, strengthen civic trust, because to a large extent, open data and citizens engagement actually are both committed to civic trust, but they are quite often never talk to each other. And so how do we use open data to improve and increase civic trust in cities? And of course, we're going to focus on New York City today. But also, how do we use open data to actually measure civic trust? How do we know whether we actually have civic trust, and how do we improve it as well? And can we actually use open data as a tool to not just improve it, but also to actually understand what is the current state of civic trust as well? And so that's what we will focus on. And we will do that by, of course, tapping into the wisdom that resides within New York City, which we brought here to the table as well. And so we have a wonderful panel that will reflect on the opening questions here, but also go deeper in some of the projects that they're working on, some of the initiatives that they have initiated, because to a large extent, Open Data Week is also about celebrating what is already happening, what is good, what is actually already working, but also what do we then need to do more as a result. And so let me briefly introduce the panel, starting with Betsy McLean. Thanks, Betsy, for being here. And Betsy McLean is the New York City Chief Engagement Officer. Right? And that's in itself already kind of quite a title, meaning if you want to have kind of titles on your business card, Chief Engagement Officer, it sounds pretty good, Betsy. And you're at the office of the mayor, New York City office of the mayor. And of course, this is also a unique initiative where you actually have an office of engagement. And so we will talk about that in a second. Then we have Dr. Elena Krumova, who is coming all the way from Columbia University, which is impressive, the way, anyway, the distance that you took to be here. Quite often, of course, as you know, those two campuses are kind of miles apart, but delighted that you crossed that bridge as well. And so you are the director of something called Quantitative Methods in Social Science, but also part of a consultancy around using data for public good. And so thanks for being here, Elena. Then we have Ali Finn, who is a senior researcher and organizer of the Surveillance Resistance Labs, which we will hear about more in a second as well, which is really trying to also not only use data to improve the world, but also to actually challenge on how we collect data and use data, and how can we actually use data to become more aware on how data is being used, which I think is quite interesting, because I always say quite often we need more data about the use of data, because the data sector is quite often the least data-driven sector that I've sometimes come across. And then we have, of course, also from the Surveillance Resistance Lab, Maya Wolochem, who, in addition to all her work at the lab, also is an adjunct at NYU Wagner, but before was also at the Ford Foundation working on public technology, and we will hear from that as well. And then last but not least, of course, we have Oscar Romero, who is our co-host and co-organizer together with, of course, CUSP as well. And Oscar is the Chief Information Officer of the Civic Engagement Commission here in New York City, but of course has a long-standing commitment and also experience in the city on how do you actually think about engaging with citizens and communities in new ways. So as you can see, massive lineup here. And let me start with Betsy. So Betsy, as mentioned, you're now in charge of the Office of Engagement at the Mayor's Office as well. And so eager to hear from you, first of all, what is the office? But also, how does it relate with the topics at hand that we seek to cover today, right, which is really about civic trust, but also about how do we then leverage data and engagement to strengthen it, and how do we actually know whether we have it? Over to you.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. It's good to be with you. Particularly good to be in Brooklyn. So thank you so much to everyone who organized the panel, and to Stefan. Excited to be here with you all. I guess I would say that my career has been data adjacent. And so I have a lot of data envy. I'm like always really excited to work with all of my pals who are really good at data, and intrigued by all of the things that data can leverage. The way I think about data in particular is around qualitative data. And so I'll talk about that in a minute. Maybe first I'll just describe the Office of Engagement. So it's a brand new office. It's actually kind of like the manifestation of a long held dream, I think, of many folks in the city. I started my career as an urban planner working out in East New York, developing affordable housing and engaging the community in kind of community-wide planning. And we were often on the receiving end of really bad engagement, like really bad engagement, particularly city-led engagement. And then that kind of followed me through my career as I went from East New York many years later to run Hester Street, and we worked throughout the city in neighborhoods, kind of in all 5 boroughs, and then kind of nationally, that kind of trend of really just poorly executed community engagement that in many ways left communities feeling more alienated, less engaged, and really diminishing civic trust. And so, you know, that was kind of my mission in life, was to work with government to kind of bridge that gap. Because that is, you know, if government isn't working by and for the people, then what is it doing? And there's just been too long a history of government doing harm to communities without community input. So like, let's figure out how to fix that. And so when, you know, during the transition between the 2 administrations, I had the opportunity to lead the Civic Engagement Committee of the transition team, and gathered lots and lots and lots of people's opinions about what we can do to like really essentially bolster the civic infrastructure of the city. And one thing that we really found that was missing is that there are, you know, so many city agencies, right? You know, there's something like 380,000 city workers, and every single agency engages New Yorkers in one way or another. The issue, what we really kind of diagnosed, which wasn't rocket science, but was that oftentimes that engagement was it's just not coordinated. So everyone's kind of out talking to folks in their different corners about their specific issues, but not really feeding the information back to kind of HQ, also not talking to each other. So if Oscar's working in Brownsville and I'm working in Brownsville, we're not likely not speaking to each other about what's happening. And the way that lands with communities is like, A, you guys don't know what you're doing. You're not talking to each other. B, I feel like if you're not talking to each other, then this clearly isn't important to you. And so, you know, why would I bother? And so that was one of the big ideas, was like, let's just make sure that we offer a space, a vehicle for coordination and collaboration among city agencies, so that folks are talking to each other, learning from each other, creating partnerships, synergies, like all of that stuff. And so that we're really being able to kind of gather all of the data that we're finding in communities and really taking it back to kind of policymakers, decision makers, because the worst thing you can do is engage someone, like ask someone their opinion and then not do anything about it. So that was like kind of the impetus behind the Office of Engagement and this kind of first ever Chief Engagement Officer position. The two other things that we really think about are, so like first, let's create a space for coordination and collaboration among agencies. Second, let's provide technical assistance, because not everyone knows what good community engagement is. So like make sure that folks have the tools and resources they need to do it well. And then third, there's really a data component of making sure that all of that data, that qualitative data we're collecting from communities, we're taking back and using to inform policies and programs.
Great, thanks so much. And just as a follow-up question, so Open Data Week, and of course, I think Zach should correct me, but one of the most popular open data sets is, of course, 311 data. And so wondering how that plays into, into the work that you are doing, because clearly, 311 data is a signal, right? Because it's not, quite often collected through engagement, but it is, typically a complaints kind of signal. And so how do you bake that in, if at all, in, for instance, the work you do? And is this a result of also having it openly available?
I think one of the things that we're really trying to do is map out the landscape, the community engagement landscape, including the data landscape. 311 plays an important part in that kind of ecosystem, but it is just one. I think what's really important. I think kind of from my point of view is that they're like not any one form of engagement do all. I mean they're like 8.5 million New Yorkers. So not everyone, there's a slice of the population that uses 311. There's a slice that goes to public meetings. There's another slice that will respond to surveys. There's another slice. Do you know what I mean? So I think that the key to me is to have a full picture. You need all of the data. 311 is one slice, but important to recognize that really it isn't a slice that's used by all communities all the time.
Over to you, Elena. So tell us a little bit about the work you do, but also given the fact that a lot of the data crunching quite often happens without actually engagement, right? So eager to hear on how you go about that as well, and how then, you can use open data, but then together with citizens determine what the questions are, for instance, for which open data is used. So over to you.
Thank you. Yes. Hello, everybody. I'm so happy to be here and share my experience, mostly as a user, as you pointed out, of public data. So to reiterate, I work at Columbia. I teach MA students in quantitative methods in the social sciences. So I instruct their thesis, and a lot of them do use 311 data. They use MTA data. They use ACS, American Community Survey data, any kind of really data is that they can put their hands on, they're going to use for thesis. Another aspect of my work is that I advise a small consulting company that a friend of mine started, which is called the Public Good Consulting. And it is, working with local communities on projects, mostly kind of around community engagement, but it's also using a lot of public data that the city provides. So based on these two things, I first would like to kind of go back to that term civic trust and kind of think about what that means and how we define it, right? And I'm sure, there'll be maybe a discussion around this, but when I think of civic trust, you can think of various ways around it. One aspect of it is trusting government, right? This is, I think, what Betsy's main job is, to engage people so that they trust and have confidence that the government is there for them. Another aspect of it is trusting each other as citizens, that we can do things together and that perhaps this data that's there will empower us to do so. So this is the aspect that I mostly like to focus on, is how to empower people to actually use this data beyond just the initiatives that the city may have. And then the third aspect of it is, as I was thinking about, is trusting the data that's actually produced, and whether you'll talk about surveillance. So there's ways of diminishing that trust and making that data less reliable if people start thinking that it's being used towards ends that are not really in their best interest. So we can undermine trust by doing some things that, even though the data is public and it's transparent and it's accessible, if we don't put good guardrails around it, it may result in actually driving trust down. So these are some of the questions that we discuss with students in the class as well. I can give a couple of examples of things that they have done with public data. For example, one of the more innovative ones that I remember was a student used MTA data to try to predict which neighborhood is most likely to get gentrified next, on the idea that this will be predicted by swipes of cards on weekends, an increase of swipes of cards to particular neighborhoods on weekends, which the idea there is people are going to check it out. There may be more things happen, like restaurants or other things happening. So this is going to be like the next one. So this was done very well. Another one was using 311 data and kind of trying to see, is there a difference between rich, poor, and gentrifying neighborhoods in terms of complaints? Like, who's complaining the most, essentially? And it's, it's the gentrifying neighborhoods. These are two examples. Other examples which come from the public good company that I'm working with include not just quantitative data that's there. And I think these are maybe some of the best uses, is when you combine qualitative and quantitative data and put quantitative data in the hands of local communities. So one of the things we did, for example, was in one project in Queens, one in Brooklyn, where we were working with local communities to kind of think about local Jewish communities, think about what resources they have in their neighborhoods. They, at the time, this was about 5 years ago, they, numbers of Jewish households were rising in both Brooklyn and Queens. So the interest was in understanding what are the resources that they have, what kind of resources they may need. So we had focus groups, we had kind of consulting with different organizations, and we also produced an interactive map for them that they could use to see demographics, to see things like schools, temples and other things like that, and generate a discussion. So I think this was a good example of combining both, where the community itself can use these tools, and they're made easy enough to use to understand the data. But I can imagine other ways, and I hope you probably talk more about this, in which the data is being used to understand what's in it in the first place, and play with it, and just raise questions, what's in it, what's not in it, how was it collected, who collected it, and just really have engagement around data itself, which we sometimes do in class, because we constantly try to drill in their heads that, you're going to be data scientists. Most often you're just going to be given some data and given some task, but you should always go to square one and ask, what is this data? Is this the right one? How was it collected? And all of these really essential basic questions that people who are highly trained in analysis forget to ask, because they're eager to get to the exciting machine learning part. So I'm going to end there.
That's super great. And I love the examples, because it shows the power and the potential of open data. And also I loved your last example, where data was being used to actually facilitate engagement, right? So that you actually can have a map, and then you can actually use data in order to facilitate and have discussions. But also what I take away from you is that ultimately open data is about reusing data that was collected for one purpose, starting using it for another purpose, right? And I think that's where quite often also the challenges in trust on how it is being reused comes in, which gives me the ultimate platform to go to Ali and to Maya. But let's start with Ali, perhaps. And so why don't you explain a little bit what the Surveillance Technology Lab is all about? And then anyway, perhaps Maya can then connect it with also some of the issues of open data and civic trust. And then I'm sure we will have follow-up questions as well.
Sure. Yeah, I'll start and just introduce us at the Surveillance Resistance Lab. A little different meaning, but I'll take it. Resistance. And I'll just preview pretty much anything I'm going to say is going to be about power, right? And data is about power, and our interest is challenging the balance or the imbalance of power that we're in this current moment. But I'll come back to that. So the Surveillance Resistance Lab, we see state surveillance and corporate power particularly as one of the fundamental challenges to racial, economic, migrant justice, other forms of justice and equity in our society. So we do a mix of investigative research, campaign incubation, organizing, advocacy at the city level, intercity level, and transnationally, to try to, one, kind of change the conversation a bit of how we talk about surveillance, that it's not only about privacy, it's fundamentally about power, and who has power and who has information and control. And we're interested in challenging surveillance also as a way to strengthen our democratic institutions and to redistribute power from the state and corporate level to the community level. We came out of work at an immigration justice focused organization. So our work kind of started because of a long interest in tracking ICE raids in the city and seeing over time ICE's increased reliance on surveillance technology, and particularly tech-based surveillance in addition to physical surveillance. And so our core work started looking at ICE and police surveillance technologies in the city and beyond, but also smart city technologies and other types of tech that might sound like they're in the public interest, but are other ways that our data, our different communities' data, is extracted and used to control people, to deny them rights, access to resources or information, and to often mark people in permanent ways as threats. So the lab is a new formation. We're still, starting out. We're really interested in these conversations and very grateful to be included. And I think one of the reasons why we were asked, we're very grateful to be asked here today, because we have been working with a group of students at CUSP in a capstone project, diving into NYPD and city agency procurement data to try to understand the city's acquisition around surveillance technologies, which I'm happy to get into now or can save for another answer.
Perhaps you can elevate that line of thought about what is happening here. Yeah.
Sure. Well, truly, Ali is the best person to talk about the CUSP work, but I'll
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine.
Right.
Go ahead.
Suggestion, but no.
So try to be
Sure.
here, but
Yeah, thank you. So what I'll just say about data first, and sorry, I'm looking at my notes because I'm still in like COVID brain fog recovery land, is that our relationship to data, especially in the city, is that it's corporations and government agencies who are taking data on people, right? And using that to make assessments about people, about us, and using that as a way to distribute or decide who gets access to services. So our interest in data is really, how can we use open data and other tools to equalize or address those kind of power imbalances? So open data, as I'll kind of walk through in a second with this example, open data is not enough, right? Data actually has to be transparent. It has to be usable. It has to be accessible. And it has to, in order to engage civic trust, really do the hard work of revealing hard things about systems of power. So right now we are very interested in trying to figure out the city's, NYPD and beyond, the city's use of surveillance technologies and other data extractive technologies on New Yorkers. For those of you who are familiar, there's like a whole, there's a whole history of this advocacy and organizing. There's a whole budget justice campaign. And despite disclosures by the NYPD and transparency laws and budget-based organizing, we still have no idea the extent to which the NYPD and other agencies surveil New Yorkers and how they use that information. So with the help of some incredible CUSP students, we've decided to go the opposite route and start with New York City's open spending data, budget and procurement data, to try to map out the vendor relationships, the contracts, the purposes, anything we can find through there, and also what's missing. There's also a huge, and I won't monologue about this, but I can, so come back. There's a huge history of open data being presented as open and transparent, but at the same time, really key parts of that data being actively hidden from the public. And that's what we see in spending data as well. There's a history of the NYPD, the comptroller, other offices agreeing to not release information about the most concerning contracts to the public. And there's still in New York City's procurement data, almost 5 million spending records where the vendor is anonymized over the past 12 years. And there's no policies on that. And there's no conversation about that. And so we're working with these students to understand what data is being anonymized and why.
Thank you so much, Ellie. I think that was such an excellent introduction to sort of this inquiry that we do broadly have about power and our understanding, especially on this question of civic trust. I know one of the questions that we've just been raising is sort of how do we measure that? How do we understand it given the open data that we have available to us? And I think one thing that Ali is really bringing up is that this question of civic trust is really contextual. I think there's certain tools that we have to tell us maybe how folks are using things that are easily available to them, like 311, like perhaps, civic engagement, as Betsy noted, in a very sort of particular lane. But I think if we zoom out a little bit further, I think, these are help to elevate understandings about folks' interaction with government. And I think that's an assumption that, many folks feel safe in interacting with government in the ways that we've presented it to them. Like 311 is a tool that will allow you to get the potholes fixed in your neighborhood. For a lot of folks, that hasn't been their experience. For a lot of folks, they've concentrated, incidents of housing injustice, concentrated incidents of, if we're using the NYPD's example, arrests, like, a deep history of really extractive interactions with the city, not just in New York, but in a range of cities around the country. So I think to go back to this question about how do we measure civic trust, I think one thing that I'm always interested in is I think, based on the assumption that folks are engaging with government, I think we can broaden that question to really expand upon what are the ways in which historically government has engaged with the public? Are there areas that, really can help us understand why it is that folks aren't relying on 311 or other tools? Has there been a concentration of when folks have relied on things like, housing court, are they getting things that they might ask of the city? Are we seeing that, when folks are relying on, transportation is working in the way that it could and it should for, all New Yorkers in an even fashion? And so I just wonder, I appreciate Ali for this exploration about power, because I think there's a more liberatory way that we can consider the interaction between what data is telling us about our interactions between New Yorkers, but also between how government is best serving the needs of the people in an even and equitable fashion.
That's great. And do you see, because anyway, some of the work we've done on using open data is indeed the ways that actually can inform some kind of new advocacy, right? So that you actually can use data to actually show, some of the injustices or power asymmetries that exist. And so do you see, because you've worked also at the Ford Foundation, trying to also see, do you see this kind of new kind of data-driven movements, right? Do you see that flourishing? Is that the result of open data that is now being available? Is it a result of becoming more data literate? And so I'm trying to understand whether there is a new kind of movement that is data-driven that you feel is a result of actually having open data?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I think that open data is one tool or sort of expression of the way that we see governance changing, or really, advocacy changing. But I often wonder whether we can, I guess, similarly be more expansive about the communities and types of ways that we're engaging around open data. I'll name one example. We have a range of grantees that are focus on civic engagement. I used to work on the civic engagement and government team at Ford. We do a lot of work in New York. There are some examples like Make the Road, like the Minkwon Center up in Queens, that are doing really amazing work at a hyper local level on some of these really complex edge cases that are around data, advocating for undocumented folks, advocating for folks whose primary language is something other than English, that elevate that the ways that we're using data in those context is very different from the ways that the open data community often talks about how we can use data for good. As an example, some of the communities in those spaces really benefit from marginality and maybe being illegible by data in the way that we typically understand it. We can name, it is very difficult to be seen in data, let's say if you are an unbanked person, because sometimes there's real benefit to being unbanked in that particular context. It may not work in the open data context and our sort of understanding around how financial markets work and whether there are services that we can use in that particular context. But there is a necessity to that understanding about how privacy, how surveillance really informs the way that folks move throughout those communities. And so I really think that, one thing that I've just observed, I worked at Ford for some time, but I was also previously working in a civic tech space. I worked for a ton of cities working on these questions. And I think we come with an assumption that legibility is always going to be useful, always, and it's going to help us, really move forward in the policies that we might want to see. But I think I would love to see, the open data community and, meet the civic engagement community where we do have these edge cases and real questions about what the future of the next generation of open data looks like, particularly because I think that's where some of the meatier, more really, really important questions that can help inform what the next generation of the open data, protocols, community types of ways that we're engaging with folks really look like in practice.
Wonderful. And I think that's a great point. And I will come back to that on how do we engage around data, right, in a more structured way. And Betsy, just prepare yourself. That's going to be my next question to you as well. But I think this is also, I guess, the point of Open Data Week is to actually have that kind of conversation, which is why it's so great to have you all here on the panel to actually make those points and call for an engagement. But let's go to Oscar. And so thanks for your patience to be the last one here, but it gives you also the luxury to answer anyway, whatever is not mentioned yet. But first of all, you're of course now CIO of the Engagement Commission. So perhaps it would be good to tell a little bit about the Engagement Commission as well, which I think is a fascinating new initiative as well. But then also bring it back to data and specifically to non-traditional data, right? Because you have government data, but you also have other data being collected in cities that could benefit citizens, but also could harm them again, and trying to understand how we need to have an engagement about that, but also a public conversation, even during open data, because a lot of that data is actually not open, right? So over to you, Oscar. Too many questions at once, but I'm sure you can handle.
Thank you so much. Well, so I mean, a few words about the commission first, and I think I really want to take on your point around power, because I think everything around civic engagement is really fundamentally about power, and the commission is no exception to that. It was voted in a general election. It was voted for. It is one place in the charter of the city of New York that mandates a commission to actually increase civic trust and work to increase participatory democracy in a variety of ways. We manage the citywide participatory budgeting. The first time that it's been done citywide, it's just this year. Just to give you a sense of what that actually means, participatory budgeting is about taking a piece of the city budget and then bringing it back to New Yorkers in a way that they can select how exactly they would like that money to be spent in their neighborhoods. The city has been doing participatory budgeting for a while through city council, and it often is done in capital projects. The commission is working on a purely expense project, which means that it has to be done within a year. And just to give you a sense of the scope, $5 million are going to be invested across New York City. We did more than 514 workshops in a period of 2 months, engaged more than 12,000 New Yorkers, collected more than 4,000 ideas. And we manage these workshops in more than 8 languages. So that's the kind of like deep engagement that the commission does. We also provide assistance to community boards, provide language access to poll sites during elections, and manage Democracy NYC, which is the city's arm to get out of vote, ranked choice voting, education that the city does. So that's a little bit about the commission, and my role, particularly as a CIO, is really focused on 3 things. On one end, to create the infrastructure that we use to undertake these participatory processes. We use open source technology to do that. We try to build the capacity, the technical capacity of the civic engagement agencies in the city. It is also to take a look at technology for the implementation of the projects. In the next year, we're going to be implementing between 40 and 50 projects across the city, funded in between $50,000 and $250,000 each, to address a variety of issues. Depending on the issue, technology could play a role in supporting the organizations. So we take a look at that. And then finally, we create positions for what the city should be thinking about in terms of civic engagement as the technology landscape changes and new problems that no agency was designed to address come up. So that's kind of the scope of the work. But I want to go back to your question about power. I think everything when it comes to civic engagement is fundamentally about power. Is it who are you listening to? And that comes back to, what is the role of the state? And let's be honest, for decades, New York City government and most governments across the world were designed, especially in the local context, as administrative governments. There was this fake notion that there was something neutral that had to be managed. And in that neutrality, lots of inequality was hidden and developed, whether it was redlining in terms of financial services, whether it was infrastructure, broadband infrastructure, access to parks and services, schools, the quality of the things you get, how often pickup delivery services for you, pickup trash services come to you. There's all these different layers of inequality that we operate upon. And so the challenge, our view of what the role of the government is to address that poverty and inequality. And that's the beginning, that's the starting point. That's why civic engagement matters so much in the process of actually changing who has been making these choices, right? And now when it comes to how does that look on a daily basis, I think one of the challenges is to de-romanticize civic engagement. There's this notion of post-its and tables and forums, and there's a lot of ways in which, particularly in the context of campaign, civic engagement happens. These town halls, one mic, people go and talk about challenges that are fundamentally troubling. Like, for instance, if you have a town hall and then you have a poor note taker, often these note takers don't speak 12 languages. So then what do you think happens when these note takers do not know the language? Then you see Spanish, ... Korean, ... And what does that mean to the people that took the time to be in that place in the first place? So the way we think, and to connect this with data, the way we did civic engagement in the past can no longer be the way we do it today. And that requires us to increase the technical capacity of agencies to be better at qualifying the data that we collect and codifying the data that we collect. And increasing the number of spaces in which we do that. That just means that literally when you hire a community manager that is going to be going to places, the skill sets they need to know are way more complex than they were before. Another challenge around de-romanticizing data is what kind of conversation you're actually expecting to have. When people take the time to go and talk to you about transportation in the city, trust me, it's not because that they couldn't find something better to do. It's because they're angry, because they're upset often about something that should have been fixed already. And this is not the first thing they're telling you. And it stops them from doing what they want to do to the extent that they'd rather go and tell you to your face. That's the context, right? So often building capacity means creating the spaces for this dialogue where you have to acknowledge that anger, frustration, disappointment are the emotions that people are coming to you to give you. And that just takes, again, a very different skill set for somebody to take responsibility to and then start a conversation. Another element is how all this data that we start collecting can actually be displayed in a way. And I think context matters a lot. For instance, I think what NYC planning is doing with the community profiles, if you go and check it out, is a very interesting way to bring a bunch of different data sets together. Because what happens is often that different agencies with very limited budgets, by the way, have to go around and do their processes for whatever purposes. So say, for instance, you have the Economic Development Corporation doing some assessment in Inwood about food security, right? And the funding they have for that particular purpose might not be available for other places, but then that data is now available, right? And so creating these spaces that provide, like the community profiles that provide context, that bring all this ACS data together, 311 data together, different land use data together, and all these different qualitative research studies that happen on silos to one place allow us to then prevent that situation of them coming to communities multiple times. Another challenge is that civic engagement actually has a toll on communities, right? And different agencies, for good reason, should be engaging people multiple times. And that often means that community organizers could come back to you and literally, like in my experience at some point, I was talking to one of the mayor public housing organizers in the city. They own a lot of property and provide affordable housing for folks. And And as I was explaining the participatory process we wanted them to be part of, they were just looking into the desk and then took a big box, put it in front of me and said, we worked with EDC on this project for 4 years. It looks very good here. Why should I trust that you're different? And then what is happening, by the way, you know this, EDC is supposed to do this, right? And as a government representative, you have to take responsibility for that, right? And I think that is the next part of the question. Why I think open data is so fundamental, right? Not all agencies are going to be able, I mean, no agency is going to be able to address all the different problems that community members are going to show. There's many problems that are going to belong to different agencies or to even different parts of the government. That's a whole other problem. You know, government is not a monolith. In the way, in collecting the data and qualifying the data, yields the answer to actually distribute that to the places where it needs to go. So then, for instance, you can come back to a community member and say, this is not a challenge that my agency is working on, but here is how we made that information available for the agency that is supposed to address that, whether it is at the local, state, or federal level. That kind of tracking, that accountability, that is something that open data can actually help us do. And then the final thing I will say is about this notion of government not being a monolith, right? What trust means is absolutely different for agencies that do different things. It is not the same to be an agency that does enforcement. And enforcement can look in many ways, not only in the context of policing. It can be, for instance, around sanitation services. It can be the quality of the different buildings that you have. Very different from the work on emergency response that the folks on homeless services work on that, or the different folks in the Department of Health. Very different from planning and resiliency and mitigation work that the Mayor's Office of Sustainability might be doing. What engagement looks like for all of these different areas of work should be different and demands different technical capacity, different in-depth conversations, and again, demands that we as a city are need to not only create places that can lead the exchange for civic engagement practices and methodology, but that every agency develops their own toolkits to how to have those very important conversations themselves.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Oscar. That was a lot and all very valuable. And again, anyway, we could go in all kinds of directions here. But also, I do want to anyway have this not just about a conversation about citizen engagement, but also try to engage with the audience itself. So if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand. But also, I actually might call upon you directly as well to get started. But I do want to follow up on kind of one of the themes here that is emerging, which is how do you actually engage citizens around data, right? And perhaps Oscar, I want to start with you and then go to Betsy. And as some of you might know, what we tried to do here at GovLab during the pandemic was something called the data assembly, right? Which was a citizens assembly around how do we actually use data during COVID-19. And that was an extremely insightful, I would say not perfect, but insightful kind of exercise that people are sophisticated when it comes to data. It's not like, they need, years of training. Maybe perhaps at Columbia you can provide those, but they are quite sophisticated about, what their concerns are. Also, what they want data to be used for. It's not all anti, right? It's actually, they actually have expectations that if you have data, you should use it. But I think that was kind of a one-off. And so I'm trying to, try to ask all of you, how do we actually institutionalize that? How do we do it kind of ongoing kind of conversations about data? Because exactly different use cases will require different kind of conversations because, as you mentioned, it's context specific. So over to you, Oscar, on how would you organize, especially as it relates to open data, because you have participatory budgeting. I mean, what about participatory data conversations where you actually could say, well, what data does the citizens want to have open? And can they vote, for instance, on which one should be priority? I mean, is that something that we could just apply and have a kind of it's a different kind of engagement, but is that something that you see is needed around open data so that actually would not only demystify or de-romanticize public engagement, but also demystify data quite often by actually having more of a public conversation about it. Anyway, over to you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I will actually challenge you back on that and say participatory budgeting is about open data, right? So in the sense that I think the way we do any kind of civic engagement is really around the needs of New Yorkers, right? It's not about, I mean, we want to talk to them about lots of things, but it really is about what they need. And so when that is the departing point, then we can have a number of different conversations with folks. For instance, for all the PB sessions that we run, we collected data around the problems that New Yorkers were facing, strategies of how they wanted those problems to be addressed, which, for instance, if we talk about Brownsville and we talk about safety, they were very clear: no policing, no surveillance, no crime predictability, right? Figure it out. And then some folks will tell you solutions, right? And so problems, solutions, concerns, that's what we often heard. And it is our job to take what New Yorkers want us to be working on and then break it down into shareable information that then can be used for all sorts of purposes, whether it is to shape legislation or the policies that different city agencies are putting together. Now, the other thing I will say is how this input is informed is very different. So some folks might, for instance, tell you, we have a concern, we're worried that you're saying that you're going to do a rezoning in this neighborhood and that is going to create these many luxury apartments. But last time we checked in these other neighborhoods, other rezonings happened and then they created thousands of luxury apartments that displace people. Why should I trust you, right? Why should I believe you? And that to me takes me to a core question, right? Around this notion of distrust. I actually think that what matters is that we engage people in critical thinking. I think that when people blindly trust anybody, any institution, that can lead to a lot of different problems, right? See what happens with the Trump administration, the elections, the January 6th, all of that. So for me, critical engagement is really what matters. When folks come and tell you that they don't think you're doing your job right, that gives you the ability to then pivot and change and do better, right? So I'll leave it at that, then I'll pass it around.
It's my turn.
Sure. Yeah.
Sure.
I think self-organizing is all. Anyway,
Yeah, sure.
So I don't want to be anyway.
I don't want to steal the mic from you. Okay. I just have an example that it reminds me of, around these questions of, particularly around data, on these thornier questions around power, legibility, surveillance, all these things. I think we have a really salient example in what happened with the 2020 census that brings up a lot of these questions around how do you get folks to trust in government? How do you feel that this data is not going to be used for, again, very contextually, we were in an environment in which there was a lot of fear about how that data was going to be used later on. Are there reuse cases that are going to, punish me, years down the line? And we have had historic examples of that as well. But I think one thing that we saw from, just with my philanthropic hat on, my old philanthropic hat on, that there was a ton of organizing that happened at a really, really hyper-local level around trying to get folks to understand the purpose of the census, really feel safe around it, feel like there were stewards that were going to, in context, speak my language, help me understand what is the purpose of this, what it's going to be useful for. Is it useful for me to participate and in which ways? And I think that effort, it happened around the country. There are lots of hyperlocal examples, lots of New York City, agencies and community-based organizations were a really active part of, defining the terms of how that engagement was going to look, what it was going to look like, who it was going to reach. Do we need a door-to-door strategy? Are there other things that are going to be, tools that may not be of the academy or may not be, in City Hall, but are really, really useful in trying to translate the absolute necessity of us having really nuanced conversations around what it means to be represented in data, what it means to, there were also power conversations happening there, reclaiming, filling out the census enables you to have more, political representation, more funding. There's all of these things that are downstream effects that I think are similar arguments that we make about open data that, well, we really need this because it's going to help us, put some actual emphasis behind certain policy ideas or really, move certain initiatives forward. I think that there's a lot of learning that we can unlock there and a lot of organizations, constituencies, different types of groups that were part of that effort that have a lot of knowledge about how to translate that towards, a range of different contexts. They do it every 10 years. I think it's a really, really great effort. But they're also having to do it around redistricting. And I think a lot of those organizations and new coalitions that came up as a result of that are also really, having a wealth of knowledge about how to translate this in new ways. So that's.
Add
Yeah,
something
we
or,
can go
okay,
down.
sorry, Beth. I can pass it to Betsy and then come back. Okay, I think the census point, I'm loving this conversation about power. Surprise, surprise. I think the census point is so key because the other, and I'm not an expert on that process, but the other component of that is that there's deep protections about how that data is used and a public conversation about how that data is used. And you have a long process of engaging, hyper localized organizers, communities, organizations to make sure that the protections around data access and retention and anonymization hold true so that it can be used to, for a number of reasons, but including to increase people's power and access to resources and representation and a whole, all of the benefits that come down the line. And that's often not the case, right? And that's not necessarily because of bad intention, but a lot of time when data is collected, whether by, a third-party app on your phone with a tracker in it, or a well-meaning project that might be a public-private kind of partnership, those parameters around data retention, minimization, and reuse are not often there or not often to the extent that they need to be. And this is going to be an unpopular answer on Open Data Week, but I'm also a data adjacent person, so I'll take the risk, is that a lot of times the way to actually build trust is to commit and not keep the data, right? To use the data for only the purpose that it was meant to be used and then not retain it. And the very quick example I'll give there is the ID NYC fight that happened over many years. ID NYC is our municipal ID card in New York City. It was a call from a range of communities for a long time across the city, representing folks who had difficulty accessing government identification. So ranging from people without documentation to young people to formerly incarcerated people to houseless people, a whole range of communities and constituencies, public transit riders, right? There was a number of fights that happened in actualizing the ID NYC, but one of the ways that community trust was gained is about not retaining people's application data beyond the purpose of getting them the ID. And that ID opens up people's access to banking, to other forms of identification, to driver's licenses, now that we have green light, to access to school and jobs, a whole host of things that people need to live their lives. And the trade-off is, okay, the city doesn't have a little bit more data about this, group of people or these groups of people, or 1.2 million cardholders now. But also ICE doesn't have access to that data, right? Data brokers don't have access to that data. And a number of people who might use that data for ways that restrict people's access or actively harm people also don't have that. So I think that was a huge trust building moment, and one that we as advocates have had to fight repeatedly to maintain.
Great, thanks. And again, I like the conversation because anyway, I think we have to have an open conversation about open data. So I think it's appropriate during Open Data Week to not just look at it. Anyway, everything has to be open, which I think was never the intent of open data, right? But also have a clear understanding on the challenges with regard to reuse, because I think that ultimately is what it's all about, right? Reusing data for other purposes. Over to you.
I'm going to be very quick. So just wanted to continue on that thought, because I very much agree with the idea that, yes, open data is great. And we're currently discussing civic trust, but it's out there also for private companies to use, right? So your concern was mainly with government using the data and not retaining it. But I think if government demonstrates care and concern for the data that it's collecting in more ways than just when it collects it, let's say for government purposes, that will increase trust in data overall. So one example I can give is more and more I'm starting to see various businesses requiring ID that they scan, and I don't know if they retain the data or not, and I don't know if I'll trust if they say that they don't retain the data. Just to enter some location, right? So if there is some kind of decision on the city level that you cannot deny access to a building because you don't want your data to be scanned and retained, that will, kind of support that idea that the government is careful with data. Another example is what happened with Zillow, right? So Zillow is this real estate website that uses a lot of private data, but also a lot of municipal data on, properties. And what it did essentially is also build an algorithm, this estimate, right, which gives you they predict how much this house or apartment is going to cost in the future. And then they also built a business model based on that. So they themselves got into the business of buying houses that they predicted should increase in value, which led to certain neighborhoods, right? So there were a lot of critiques on the algorithm itself, but the point here is that this open data is a public resource that's using for private purposes that are not often to the public good, right? I mean, the idea is there that it provides a service. People can look up a property, can see a lot of information in one place, but it also has unintended consequences, or perhaps intended, but we can assume for their sake that they were not intended. So some kind of ethical constraints around data that's public, that's being produced by the public, that's maintained by government. These are public resources. How companies that are private can use this data, that could also mean increasing trust in providing data.
Great.
Yeah,
No, I
have to say, but
you had a long.
to be doing my job as a chief engagement officer, I didn't turn to that. We've been talking at you guys for a really long time. I'm happy to talk, but would much rather hear from you.
Yeah, any questions, any reactions, any reflections? I might actually call upon Adrian, if that's okay, to get started. And for those who don't know, Adrian was, of course, I think those discussions about citizen engagement, civic engagement. I still remember visiting you at your office where we had that discussion as well. And so what, from your perspective, how does what we heard here today, how does that resonate?
Thank you.
And just a second, we were planning on having a workshop as well, but this is a small enough group anyway to have kind of an open conversation from my point of view, unless anyway we want to reorganize ourselves. But I think this is actually the right size for having that kind of conversation.
Thank you, Stefan, and thank you to all of the panelists, both for your thoughtful responses and also for the work that you're doing and the conversation that you're driving. As Stefan mentioned, I used to work with the great team here on open data and a lot of different data projects with the city of New York. And I mean, I think that there's a lot of experimentation and innovation that can and should be happening. There's a lot of history that we need to take into context when we're thinking about responsible data reuse. I'm really curious, just to put a question back to the panelists or anyone in the audience, is around what kind of innovation in this space is exciting to you? What kind of solutions and ideas do you think is really bringing responsible data reuse to communities, or is planned for the future? Because I think, Stefan just mentioned some experimentation that we worked on together a long time ago. I remember knocking on the door of city council and participatory budgeting to say, like, look, here's open data. Maybe it could be used to help identify problems in communities. And, things will stop and start over time. I think COVID, which we all experienced over the last few years, was an interesting catalyst for a lot around data reuse, whether here in the city or elsewhere. So yeah, just a few thoughts, but also some questions back to others. Yeah, so you should think about the question, but I do want to call upon you, Adrian, one more second, because one of the things that Adrian is also involved in is what Jackie Liu, who was also working on open data in New York City, has established, which is kind of an icon of several icons that express surveillance through Internet of Things, and how that actually enables public conversation by actually seeing the icons that this is anyway surveillance happening here for those purposes, so that you have actually a better understanding on how data is being collected. And so let me throw it back to you so that I give the panel some time to think about your question. But how does that, for instance, from your point of view, actually enables citizens engagement around surveillance, for instance, right? If you can, or data collection, and is that something that we should also have around open data? Because I still remember
at a certain point in time, we were thinking about why can we not have in the subway, anyway, indications that this was, and it happened at a certain point in time, this was powered by open data, so that you actually have a better sense on how open data is used, not just delivered, right?
Yeah, so the project that Stefan is referencing, so I also work with Helpful Places, which is a company that stewards the open source resource called Digital Trust for Places and Routines, or DTPR. You might be familiar with it as a project that started and was incubated with Sidewalk Labs and spun out. It's no longer being run by them. It's run by our organization and headed by Jackie Liu. It's Stefan mentioned, former New York City Parks tech and data leadership. And what DTPR is and does is it's a taxonomy, a series of icons, and a process for identifying in simple terms signage for technology in public spaces and providing more information via a QR code about the data and technology that's in that public space. So how can we bring this invisible infrastructure that's on our city streets and bring more legibility to it? I thought, Maya, your point about legibility being this interesting assumption is something that's positive. I took a few notes on that and found that to be interesting, and we'll be thinking on that a little bit further. But it is our assumption that legibility is a good thing, and at least a step forward from where we are today. And so there is a lot in terms of thinking about, I think, open data also as this invisible layer within our city, right? This form of invisible information and infrastructure, how can we tap into that further? DTPR is aiming to help demystify technology in public spaces. We're doing that in a few different cities around the world. There's a little bit of it happening in New York City through In Situ, which I think Donna was here and she left, but worth checking that out for the streets of New York. And otherwise, a lot of other opportunities for, again, I think, bringing this interesting invisible layer to how our cities work, how our worlds work, both into communities and for driving impact through that legibility.
Great. Thanks. I wanted to anyway make sure that example of innovation was already featured. So yeah, any innovations from your perspectives? There you go.
Yeah, I have some. So I think, I mean, to me, like the most important innovation is for communities to see themselves reflected in data. And I think the way to do that is to make sure that they're defining the data the data that's most important to them. One thing we talk about all the time is measuring what we value. And so making sure that those values are community defined values. And then from there, we reverse engineer to identify indicators. I think, Alina, one of the things that you said about civic trust, you know, it's this two-part components of like kind of people in government, but also people and people. And so one of the things that we are kind of cooking up, last year we did a big kind of policy survey called NYC Speaks, and we had something like 67,000 responses, 18,000 or more from young people in the city. And that became this kind of like, much to our joy, really kind of a fundamental component, while many of the new kind of commissioners and agency heads were coming up with their priorities and policies for the year. They kind of would refer back to what like New Yorkers say, that housing is safety, is public safety. In their minds, housing is related to public safety. So I think that's something that we're super interested in kind of institutionalizing. And in that institutionalizing, you know, a survey that expresses, that captures both kind of almost like government performance. So like to really get at kind of procedural justice, right? The issues that you talked about, Maya, of like, is government delivering across the city equally? Do folks, is government doing its job? Spending our money well, doing what it's supposed to be doing? Do governments do communities trust that government will deliver? So that's one component. I really think alone, it's not enough. It really like kind of lends to a customer service perspective, which I think it really strips democracy of its soul. When you talk about New Yorkers as consumers, as opposed to as partners in democracy. I think the second component really goes to Maya's point about people and people is really kind of more about well-being, about what are New Yorkers' experience of living, like how connected do I feel to my neighbors? How much do I feel like I have some agency over what happens to my family, to my block, to my community, to my borough, to my city? So getting at those kinds of questions. And when we define that, like, what does that look like? One of the things that we've been using as like kind of our markers, the Kingdom of Bhutan has a gross domestic index of happiness, really thinking deeply about what are those indicators and how do New Yorkers define what is happiness? Everything from how I use my time to how connected I feel to my neighbors. So really kind of combining those two things to get a full data picture of communities, I think is an innovation. Because someone was talking about, I think Oscar, you were talking about DCP's, city planning's community district profiles, which I've used for decades as an urban planner, that really tell one part of the story. And being in any one of the neighborhoods that DCP kind of describes, you go there and you talk to folks, very different picture. So I think, how do we capture that, reliably capture that kind of 3D data picture of neighborhoods, so then we can make informed decisions together with communities?
Yes, and I will come back to the indicators as well, especially indicators of civic trust, because that's another kind of element that we should, go ahead.
Okay, I'm just gonna take off from that and focus on the people to people. To me, that's the most exciting, because yes, I agree that when you talk about the city as just delivering services, it does have this kind of customer service perspective, which is not all, there is to trusting government. It's also about, communities come together when they have to solve problems together. That's when a community really emerges and takes shapes, and data has its place in helping that, driving that process, being useful in that process. So that's the most exciting thing to me, is how do we use that data to engender communities and then empower them to take action that they think that whatever they define as a problem. So COVID was an excellent example of that, because there was a very specific problem around which people came to understand how to use data. There was actually an interesting survey in terms of trust, civic trust, and during COVID times. So when it was measured as trust in government and experts, it was one thing. When it was measured as trust between people, it was another thing. So trust between people was actually positively correlated with increase in COVID, which may be surprising, but essentially it means that there's a lot of kind of rumors circulating in the community. So, these two aspects of trust may not necessarily track together, but I think ultimately when you provide data in people's hands and organize forums, organize what you did around COVID, that's the most exciting thing for me for the future. How do you institutionalize that? I know the census does it, continuously. They have this thing called the the Opportunity Project, where they are engaging data experts and users and people who are experts in user experience, and our students have been part of that. So they talk to communities that are going to be using something, they define the problem and so on. But these are just creating lots of interfaces, right? So one aspect of it is to create something like an app or an interface where you can visualize data in various ways and help make decisions that way. And that's valuable on its own. But to me, that's not the only outcome that's valuable. The outcome that's valuable is actually the conversations and the process that happen around that. And I hope to see more of that.
And yeah, if you have questions, feel free, or reactions, feel free to engage as well. But over to you. Yes, go ahead. Then we will come.
Ali had mentioned about not saving data, and maybe this is not a policy question yet, but can you all comment on use of data collectives or data trusts, possibilities, probabilities?
Any reactions on the use of data intermediaries, data collaboratives?
Yeah, I feel like I'm not the right person to answer this question because I'm like, let me talk to you about data brokers and how evil they are and third party. And, that's where my orientation is. So I will happily let others speak to the positive examples of that. I do think I think what's sticking with me in kind of all of these questions is just, and I say this as a person who doesn't work in the open data field, right? But it is just how far we are from, people on the street being actually able to engage with an open data set or data questions and understand how it impacts their lives, because I don't understand that sitting on this panel. I don't understand the implications of a lot of this. And I think what comes to my mind in terms of innovation and things that are exciting is, organizing efforts and projects that really reveal what the data out there says about us, because a lot of times we just don't know. For example, after the overturning of Roe v. Wade, there were some journalists who went out and spent, I don't remember exact money, but under $200 to buy data of everyone who, I'm oversimplifying this a little bit, but buy data of either who or what license plate numbers were at Planned Parenthood clinics in a particular 2-hour window on a particular date, something like that. Could get this data very easily from a private company for $200, right? Just showing how easy it is all of a sudden to surveil people seeking reproductive healthcare, potentially including abortions, right? And so I think a lot of the work that I'm excited about is saying, okay, maybe part of this data is out there because of good intention and because of public good efforts, and part of it's out there because our phones are now tracking devices in ways that I think everyone in the room probably doesn't understand the full extent of, right? So how, now that the technology has gotten so far past the policy, right? Which I'm so glad that folks on this panel are in city government and trying to help us catch up. But now that tech has gone so far past the policy, I think we're in this moment, or we need to be in this moment of kind of a public social reckoning of what data is out there, who has access, does it need to be out there, why, what protections and mechanisms can we put in place? And at the same time, as organizers, advocates, community members, how can we use that data out there to say, these are the inequities that we're experiencing, these are the injustices that people are experiencing, and push for change instead of just stopping at transparency? That's just a bunch of questions back to you all, and not an answer about anything, but I'll let others speak to data collectives.
I have like reflections on both questions. So Allie, you've reminded me of so much. I was taking notes. My things look like really ridiculous now, but I'll maybe come back to innovation first before this question. So I live in Bed-Stuy. I love Bed-Stuy. I'll be there forever, I hope. Yeah, yes. I love Bed-Stuy. And I think about this a lot in terms of Allie's point around how to make this accessible for folks. Like we talk about open data as, one element of accessibility, but in order to get to open data, the open data that we have right now, you have to access the portal. You have to have access to the things that are going to help you get there. Maybe a steward to help you get there. You have to have internet access, all those things. And to Allie's point, I think that for a lot of folks, it doesn't become real until you have a question that drives you towards that portal. There's no understanding really about how this is relevant to my life, how this is relevant to my neighborhood. But one innovation that I love many things about Bed-Stuy, but there's one that I really love in that, Bed-Stuy is a gentrifying neighborhood in Brooklyn, undergoing a lot of change. And on many of the street corners, we have a ton of really provocative, important public art around what the change is and what it actually looks like. Some of that, I think, is doing the work of what open data is really intending to do in context. So as an example, I just moved, unfortunately, but I used to live around the corner of Hancock and Tompkins. We had scaffolding around the building for a long time. And every new week, there was somebody had posted something about, I think at one point there was a map or a public art project about what change is happening in the neighborhood. Sometimes there was public art commenting around, which houses have sold recently. There was an artist in the neighborhood that had done some qualitative work around you know, talking to folks on their stoop and had printed these amazing posters. You could like click, you could go Google it and it would tell you the story of the people who lived in that neighborhood, what changes they were experiencing, what it actually looked like for them. And some of those were really, you know, data-driven projects. Others were, you know, the qualitative work that, you know, we've described as being so important to really building that civic trust. And it was in a language that me as a neighbor walking through my neighborhood who recognized that there is an importance in the change that's happening in this neighborhood. Maybe I want to go to the open data portal, but it's actually not the most accessible for first 3 to 5 to 10, 20 steps that I might take. But I would understand it and really value it if it came from my neighbors and they were telling me, you know, this is a big sheet of paper that we printed on the scaffolding that's at Hancock and Tompkins. Like, can you circle the things that make you feel uneasy or that make you feel upset about the change or that you're really excited about? I think those sorts of innovations that are really, you know, the data is describing conditions that folks are experiencing in their material lives. And it's not always that, you know, I just think that we have to lean into that more. So on this question of, you know, pulling in organizers, really, you know, doing a homebred experience of what it means to, you know, make data alive, I feel like is a really important innovation that I just wish that we pulled on more regularly. On this question of data trusts and collectives, I do think it's a very interesting and important innovation. I do think, though, it elevates some of these contentions that I think we worry about a lot. You know, data trusts have the ability to integrate some data that may provide new uses than we're used to, or new uses that may not be the intention behind why we entered into an intermediary or a trust, which is not to say that, you know, with the right actors at the table, we couldn't arrive at a solution that was equitable, that was, you know, inviting the kinds of questions around privacy and surveillance that we're really interested in. But, you know, I always wonder and worry about the actors that are invited to be part of an intermediary or a collective. A lot of times it replicates a lot of these imbalances, power imbalances, you know, imbalances of, you know, who is regularly at the table, who is regularly not at the table, that I think we really just need to be incredibly transparent around to see the kinds of change for, you know, integrated data, data trust, data collectives, intermediaries, and that we might want to see. That was a lot I've been talking.
Great. Yeah, Oscar. And also if anyone in the audience have actually suggestions, right, for innovations, I think that would be useful to know as well. And then I will, anyway, have one last question, and then we can go and commingle and have this kind of engagement over some kind of hors d'oeuvres and drinks or whatever CUSP is providing us. And thanks so much, CUSP. But over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the challenges that I see with the data collectives is, you know, which community-based organizations, nonprofits, organizers have the capacity to be at that table, right? Like the technical knowledge to actually sit at that table. And I think that poses a challenge, right? Like private companies are going to have the interest and the resources to invest and grind and take information out of whatever data they have across them. And I think how do we build that capacity in the first place so then these spaces can be accountable? It's a challenge both in nonprofit spaces and in government. As for innovation, one of the things that I'm very excited at, and I try to look at a lot, is the Global South, actually. Thinking about how particularly the communities that are represented here in New York City, where there are, you know, Southeast Asian communities, Latino communities, name it, from across the world, how do they actually ask themselves these questions? How do they think about it? Are the questions that we're asking culturally legible across different groups of people that value very different things? What actually happens when all of these groups are blended into the US political system, right? And discourse. I think, for instance, something that I've been paying attention to is the accelerator labs of the United Nations Development Program. So, you know, they work in the Global South, they have labs across the world. And what they do is they basically focus a lot on digital storytelling and how they visualize different data stories, right? For people to actually be able to advocate, organize, make decisions. So the question changes. It's not only, okay, let's make the government more accountable and put the data out there, but what are the tools that I need to give you for you to do housing organizing, which are going to be very different from the ones I need to give you for you to do, you know, organizing around NYCHA when it comes to better services, right? So I think that storytelling question in a way that is culturally competent is what I've been excited about lately.
Yeah, no, that's true. And there are beautiful examples there. I mean, we do some work with the Data Lab in Tanzania. And so they do data storaging by murals, but also even in fashion. I mean, they have actually data fashion, which I thought was kind of very fashionable in how you go out and actually represent some kind of data points and how they how they make fashion to a large extent. But there are many examples there. So I want to, yes, go ahead. Yeah, sure. And again, what I also want to have everyone think about is exactly that question about civic trust. I mean, this is about how do we get civic trust through open data and how do we measure it? But if I might call upon you on what does civic trust mean to you, so that we start getting an understanding of actually what would be indicators to measure civic trust and how do we do this also in an engagement kind of fashion. But over to you.
Thank you. So I'm actually with the Civic Engagement Commission right now. Very interested in learning a bit more about your work when it had to come with this open data assembly that you're running. And then I kind of wanted to open it up also to the panel and just kind of thinking about, we've been talking about how data is so important and it's so how it's affecting so many citizens and residents of New York City, but also then how do we educate them on these and then perhaps give them the power to decide on what are the policies that actually regulate them in a very precise, deliberative way. We just got done with doing a deliberative processes using participatory budgeting, but I'm just curious about how deliberation and how this can deepen even in organizing our policies and regulations around civic data. Your reflections on how it worked in your assembly, but then also maybe how that can open up into a deliberative process and around data in New York City.
Yeah, I think it's an important question. And I quickly gonna, just mention one thing, partly answering also to innovation or the kind of innovations we need. And partly it's indeed more engagement, but engagement that leads to something, right? And I think what we really need to innovate is what we have been calling a social license around using data, right? Because to a large extent at the moment, it's like a lot of the engagement around data is really at the point of collection through consent, right? And consent really doesn't tell you much. It's kind of binary. It's yes, no, or it doesn't give you the engagement about, yeah, sure, under those conditions, right? Nor is it very much informed. And more problematically, from my point of view, it's individual, right? It's always individual consent. It's never around, what's actually the community's interest that we want to do. And so what we are experimenting with, and part of the data assembly was actually an effort to establish a kind of social license around particular kind of use cases that you say, look, this is what the community wants with the data, either deletion or it wants actually to be used for certain kind of purposes with regard to the kinds of indicators that they want to measure, for instance. And so the social license comes from basically the extractives industry, right? Because as you know, to a large extent in the past, there were a lot of mining companies going into communities, extracting assets without community engagement. And that's when they started experimenting with the social license. And I think the same kind of notions exist in data, right? Where you actually have extraction without engagement of communities. And that's where we need kind of innovations in how do we establish those social license, realizing that it's context specific, use case specific quite often, and community specific. And that was what we tried to do with the data assembly. The use case was COVID. It was actually partly open data, but it was especially private sector data, right? Cell phone data. How would you feel about using cell phone data to monitor social distancing policies, right? Which could be misused for a variety of other cases. And what would be the conditions? And the conditions were more about not just, why do you need the data, right? But also who actually has access to data, because it matters a lot. Whether it's a data broker or whether it's, kind of a welfare official that needs the data for deciding where to target welfare better. And I think that's the sophisticated kind of discussion that we need to have that then translate, as I said, not in, all right, check, now we have done the engagement, that then translate into some kind of a social license that actually then can steer how data is being used. And we need a lot more innovation in that space. And I always look at, like for instance, the Creative Commons, which was kind of a new licensing. We need the same thing with regard to determining how to reuse data, right? Not just making it open, but then what are the conditions under which that data can be used? Anyway, you got more than you asked for, but I just wanted to indicate that there is a lot more innovation. We haven't figured it out. I mean, that was just an experiment, but it is around engagement, right? And it is around indeed new ways of then reflecting what that engagement indicated, because it's not just engagement, then you need to actually have a way to communicate what was the result of that engagement and how do we then act differently. And that's kind of the hard part as well. But let's quickly go anyway. Anyone wants to reflect? Yeah, go ahead.
Also, I know we have some people online, but so if you indicate in the chat or Q&A function in the chat, I'll also read off your statements.
Yes, there are people online. If they have questions, let us know in the chat. Yes.
Yeah, hi there. Yeah, my brain is just on fire. This is such a stimulating conversation. I'm really appreciative of the dialogue. And yeah, my name is Damien. I'm a social impact design researcher and strategist. And this last fall, I was appointed to the Mayor's Commission on Gender Equity. It got me really thinking about civics in a deep way. And so being here is also very serendipitous because I'm like asking myself this question of like, how do we create more transparency? How might we create more civic engagement in more horizontally organized fashions? I've been thinking a lot about like the commercial real estate crisis. I'm like, well, what would happen if we, created social impact, like local social impact hubs where we can have actual space where actually roles like, for folks like myself are more engaged in emancipatory design and actually are doing more facilitation, but are creating space for community members to come in, build community with each other, it's hyper local, but start talking about and identifying challenges in their community. And rather than that being the end, rather that being the start, and that from there, folks can start having conversations around solutions and prototyping solutions. And if they need to then go up to policy and be addressed policy-wise, so be it, but then at least now we're creating more transparency and more accountability with our politicians or legislators, or if it's something that could be a design solution, that could be communication design, whatever it may be. But at least in the end, we're fostering community, or at least the hypothesis may be, that we're fostering community, we're getting people talking with each other, we're also empowering individuals on a local, like grassroots level, and then also ideally creating more policy accountability. So anyways, I'm really glad to be here though, because yeah, this is kind of like, at least this inquiry and this hypothesis has kind of guided me to connect with you all. But if anybody knows of any references or where this has maybe been done, that'd be great. But I did have a question after that long framing, but it has to go back to, I think, this idea of, destabilizing power, distributing power more equitably. And I think within this question of information or data collection, whether it's quantitative or qualitative, I do think that there has been this question of extraction, right? And I think that word was also used. But I think one of the things that is powerful that I at least heard you all saying, although it was just to my ear, I don't know if this resonates with you or not, but it's actually not just, it's not just taking information, it's actually listening. It's engaged in listening to what people want, what they need. And I'm curious if that is a way of thinking about engaging with communities and data collection. How do we kind of define what that listening that practice is, and how do we incorporate that into our act of engaging and collecting this data? Thanks for all that.
Great, and why don't we take all the questions and then do a final round, because I think people are ready for drinks probably. And
I'll be brief. It's more of a thought-provoking thing that's happened has been rattling around my head. You may or may not have seen a Gothamist article last week about the Royal Palms Shuffleboard Club. There's some nods for some people. Basically, the short thing that happened here was that as a result of the Gowanus rezoning and the general Gowanus brownfield situation, it was discovered that a popular club that thousands of people a year go to was actually significantly contaminated with volatile organic compounds, and that sort of it created a classic Gothamist article about sort of why weren't people informed, and those of us who are more engaged in it and regularly visit that club sort of came to a conclusion that it wasn't as bad as the article put out there. But I think what I have to think about in terms of my government hat is nominally open data is where I was thinking about this. It's data because the response from the state agency DEC was we published this information. This was sent to our listservs. It was sent to communities of interest, but it became a sensation because people who were actually affected weren't engaged and were suddenly presented with information that was detrimental to their health potentially. When I'm thinking about sort of open data 2.0, what I'm thinking about is not just publishing the data for people who are potentially interested in it, but actually seeking out the communities that will most be impacted by that data. So I take that as my statement / question.
Great. And any other? Yes, Annie?
I think someone had mentioned this before that like since Roe v. Wade got canceled, like everyone is like trying to get data on people, but I'm wondering what New York State is doing to protect the women who are flocking here to do abortion from their like insurance companies who want to see like where they've been or make sure their data is not found by the states that they're coming from.
Not sure. I didn't fully get the question. Whether you got the question? Can you summarize?
I just asked like what is I just asking what New York City is going to do to protect the women who are coming here to do abortion.
All right. Okay. Thank you.
I'll just go back to Betsy and to Oscar, something that you both said that was related, I think, about the city having done several engagement efforts in the past, both that you said in your role as urban planner. Is there data available about those previous engagements that the city can now go back to and look at as a way of sort of, not going back to citizens and asking the same questions over and over again? Is there some sort of analysis we could do on that kind of historic data to then build that trust that we have listened to what you said in the past?
When?
Hi, sorry. Is there any equivalent in the US for the like nothing about us without us mantra? Is there something that gets repeated? Is there something that goes into people's education, or is it in code somewhere? I don't know. Thanks.
Is that kind of the right to be forgotten kind of environment?
No, nothing about us without us is basically
like that. All right. Yeah. Great. Cool.
It's constant policy.
Great. Yeah. Well, great questions. I give you all opportunity to answer, and then I don't know, Danielle, whether we are ready for then perhaps have the drinks and then commingle and have a broader conversation. By the way, I want to recognize Danielle, who is anyway part of the organization here. Danielle, what do you think?
Thank you all for your answers to any of these questions.
Yes, yes, but I just want to know whether we then can go to the drink. All right, okay, that's great. Thank you, Danielle. Yeah, no, I'm thinking about making sure that people that are here, but obviously I always think about food. Thanks, Danielle. Yeah. Over to you. Any reactions or any reactions or final observations that says that this is something I want
I guess I'll go to the last question since that was there. So I think that's a big deal, right? Because so often communities put so much time into these kind of planning efforts, whether they are site specific, community wide, issue specific, and so rarely do folks does government kind of return to those and build upon them. I think that's one of the things that we're trying to do is really make that an ethic, kind of a best practice of all agencies. When I was at Hester Street, we had kind of this principle of like, before you go into a community, do your homework. So essentially making sure that before any agency walks into any neighborhood, we have a repository of like the last 5 years, here are all the community engagement efforts. Here's the data. This is what community said they wanted and needed. Now it's your responsibility to build on that. Because again, one of the most offensive things you can do is walk into a neighborhood and say like, so what do you want?
I feel like we need 3 more hours just to start. Yeah, we can keep going the conversation. I wanted to touch on a few questions that were asked, and on the point first of how to decide on policies, on data protective policies in the city. I think this is a big question and one that there has been a lot of thinking around, and there's currently a lot more work, I think, on the city and state level and some ideas for like a data bill of rights and other things like that. I don't have a perfect 1, 2, 3 answer to this. I think we need a lot more deep conversation about it, but I would hope that it doesn't just talk about how to protect data once it's collected, but also governs the how of collection and the who and should be. I think one thing we see in looking at specifically kind of smart city projects, right? And these public-private partnerships is a lot of times the idea for something comes from a company that has a product that it's developing, right? That could be a good product, but it's not coming, like a lot of folks have already said in the audience or in this room, from the communities who are most impacted by it. Why do we need digital IDs? I can rant about digital IDs for an hour. I won't. Why do we need these particular components? Is the idea coming from people? Is it coming from this great work with NYC Speaks and participatory budgeting, or is it coming from more a top-down or corporate pipeline? And I think the other question the other principle that I would love to see included is something along the lines of always making sure there is an alternative, that people can always continue to engage in a non-datafied, non-tech way. Tap and go, great. Also make sure there's a cash option, and then that's the same price. There's no discount for using the tap and go or the smartphone option that doesn't apply to the cash. It should be purely equitable. It should be equally accessible. We have that in like thinking about driver's licenses, standard licenses versus the real ID, which is a whole other debate. In other forms of identification, whatever the smart option is, making sure that there's a non-smart option, right? That's just as accessible and that is not less privileged. And then I think this question of like listening and versus extraction, I think that's a great framework, and I would love to explore it further and think about data, how can data be used to listen instead of how can data be used to, how can our data be commodified and used to make money off of us, right? How instead can it be used to help address power imbalances and inequities like everyone on this panel has really committed to. And the last quick point that I wanted to make was on the question of abortion data or abortion access data, and travel data. I believe I'm happy to follow up with this one-on-one. There are some networks and organizations that are really committed to helping people travel across state lines without leaving data trails. But it's really hard. It's really, really hard. And it requires like a fundamental shifting of how we communicate, right? And how we travel, not texting, not using Facebook Messenger, all of these things. And there is some work at the state level. I would like to see more. I'm curious if anyone at the city has a perspective of how to protect that data from being shared and encouraging prosecutions of people who are seeking reproductive health care.
There's so much. Again, my notes look so wild. But I'm going to go backwards. I'm going to start with the abortion question, just because I want to uplift the work of Kate Bertash and the Digital Defense Fund. They do a really amazing work on trying to protect folks seeking abortion, funding those organizations who are really helping people, do these last mile questions that are around surveillance, but also around like really seeking healthcare. She has really amazing work and has a bunch of organizations that has done a lot of training on these questions around data protection in these really particularly difficult environments. So I'll always uplift Kate. Go look up her work. She's amazing. Okay, so on maybe it's like a collective reflection on all of these questions. I think I think it's just generally true anyway that I think that a lot of the decisions that we make in when it comes to data, open data, the kinds of data that we're collecting, how we're doing it, they can be durable. And because they're durable and a little bit can be hard to change once we're on this road, I think it's really helpful to me to think about governance once we make a decision. Who's at the table about making that decision and how are we going to continue to monitor that moving forward? So we have a lot of sectoral examples of what that can look like. I can't remember if it's Harris County. I don't know. There's an example, I believe it's in Florida, around education data. They had a particularly difficult use case in which education data was published. It revealed a lot about students and parents. It was a very, very terrible example of what happens when open data does not go to plan, and when engagement is not happening at the forefront. I believe it's Harris County. I know I'm messing that up, but regardless, this use case was really important because one of the things that they built into the next iteration was around governance, around really making sure that that table was very full of organizations who are already fulfilling many of the last mile questions that governance can't do. Those are folks who are, you know, helping families navigate through difficult educational decisions, or families seeking housing. They're organizers in that community, and they were actively a part of the decision around the politics and policies that we're going to manage open data in that county moving forward. I think it's something that we could, you know, it's a tool that we could use more regularly. And, you know, baked into that, they had some questions around, you know, allowing families and communities to opt in to data collection, which provides a little bit of agency and power back to folks, particularly in situations in which, you know, the norm is for extraction. Maybe this last piece on Gowanus, I have to go look at that piece. That was really wild. But I just wonder, so maybe I'll raise Brooklyn again, largely because there are a lot of, you know, Forbes grantees who are doing a lot of this work on actual community engagement in really meaningful ways. You know, in Bedside, we have the Brooklyn Movement Center that holds a lot of information for the community around some of these issues. And I always wish that, you know, that list is on Forbes' website. There are lots of other organizations that fund a ton of do a ton of work at a hyperlocal level, but I just always wish that those groups that have a really deep understanding, rooted understanding of what's happening in these communities, who folks are, how to speak to them, how to engage them, what they care about. I always wish that they were at the table, maybe in this room, maybe at some of those decision-making tables around what open data looks like in those contexts, because I do think it's really, really important, particularly around this governance question, and maybe on this, like, how do we get people the information that they actually need?
Well, since I'm the last one between you and your food, I'll try to be super short. Yes. But yeah, a couple of thoughts, I guess. One around your question over there regarding asking people multiple times, right? There's plenty of really great examples of processes, consultations that have been done, you know, not only NYC Speaks, but also, like, you know, I'm a fan of Where We Live, NYC, that was done by HPD. But one of the things that I think is fundamental is legislation. Are we giving organizations the funding to actually do this kind of deep civic engagement on what topics and how often, right? Like Where We Live is also is federally mandated, right? So that unlocks a number of different resources that allows for in this case, HPD to actually run a very well organized civic engagement process that is thoughtfully documented, that anybody can learn from, right? So, but funding changes completely whether or not you can actually provide this engagement in a variety of languages, whether and to what extent you can document, and then to what extent you can put policy recommendations and then take action, right? Then the second piece, and I will go back to your question around, you know, innovation labs and civic labs. You know, in some of my previous agencies, we manage a series of civic labs with the New York City Economic Development Corporation for more than 5 years. And there's a couple of lessons. One, you know, many city agencies and every administration and everywhere you go in the world, somebody's having that same idea. And it's coming up with creating a new innovation lab. And they're all very well needed, right? There's just not enough resources or government agencies talking about all the things that need to be talked about, especially in the context of like applied tech and all sorts of urban innovations. But the time that it takes to develop these labs is very considerable. Like to do a civic engagement process, to find a location, how do you choose the locations in a way that is equitable in the first place when you have limited resources? How do you get the talent to run that in the context of a government agency? Then once you get all the data, whatever your process was, what do you do with that to then create actionable projects? Assume you figure that out and you get an actual actionable project. How long does it take to implement that new project in the context of a complex topic, whatever it is, say housing, mental health, waste management, safety? How many people do you need to bring at the table to get buy-in from? how much do you need to learn to then be able to talk about that topic in the first place? It takes time. And then once you actually implement a project, how do you document everything that you learn? Do you even have the political system, like the conditions for that project to be funded, to be taken at scale? What do you learn? So to do that over and over and over is just not realistic in the context of any political cycle of a government administration. So one of the big lessons in you know, at least my personal view, is that this civic innovation should be embedded into as many city agencies as it can be, and should be tailored to what every city agency can actually do. And that is where you can actually get at scale, make something that can long last administration changes, that can change, that can survive changes in leadership and funding, versus inclusion labs, innovation labs, whatever you want to call them, that are going to be a flickering light, are going to be amazing, but they're not going to go away.
Great. Wonderful. Well, thanks so much for all those wisdoms. And just on the last point, we've done a lot of work also on innovation labs. And turns out that actually, in order to make everyone part of engagement and innovation, you just need to create an environment of permission, right? That there is permission across all agencies to actually innovate and ultimately engage. And then quite often that is a signal that is missing. And as a result, they feel it's not their job, or they feel it's not allowed to a large extent. But anyway, this was a great conversation. I took the liberty, some of you probably will hate me forever, to keep the panel going longer than expected, but I thought this was a great, anyway, environment where actually we could have more of a plenary discussion than kind of a carved out one. But now you can actually do carve out and have separate conversations over drinks and food. But before we go there, let me thank all the panelists for their extremely gracious sharing of their wisdom. Thanks also the Commission for co-organizing this, and especially CUSP for providing us with the space, but also the food that everyone is looking forward to. And especially thanks everyone here for coming to celebrate open data and have an honest conversation about open data, but also connecting it with civic trust, because I think that's really where we can make a real difference, is to think about open data as a way to contribute to civic trust, but also to contribute to the way we engage more generally. Thanks so much. It is recorded. If you want to watch another 2 hours, you can see it as well.